Good morning, everybody. It's 10:03. I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the South Atlantic LCC's October 3rd Thursday Web Forum. I'm Hillary Morris, and I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for the South Atlantic LCC. Most of you have probably joined us before, but in case we have any new people on the line, I'll run down the overall format of these calls. Each month, your cooperative hosts a web forum that features a presentation on current or ongoing work throughout the South Atlantic LCC, and that happens every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m., hence the name, and it serves as a great chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the future of the South Atlantic LCC. So every web forum has basically the same agenda. I'll start out by introducing our presenter, who will then talk about this month's topic. And after the presentation, the floor is open to ask any questions about the presentation that you might have. And today we're going to be spending a little bit of extra time on discussion to get some feedback on future direction for work like Christy's, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. And then, as usual, we'll spend the rest of the time on updates from South Atlantic staff, followed by an open discussion where anybody can ask questions about where your cooperative is headed. So I'm about to hand things off to Christy, but before we get into the heart of the webinar, I want to go over a few logistics. To minimize background noise, I always mute everybody during the presentation. So if you have any questions, either type them directly into the chat box, and I'll monitor that, or you can hold them until after the presentation. And if you do choose to use the chat box and want everyone to be able to read it, just remember to send the note to everyone. You can select your recipient from a little drop-down menu. And then to speak up at any time, all you need to do is press *6 to unmute yourself. So before I mute everyone, does anyone want to chime in with a question? All right.
The conference is now in silent mode.
Great. So presenting today, we have Christy Ihlo, who's a research associate with the South Atlantic LCC, as well as a policy associate with the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke. So she'll be talking about the work of a team at Duke that's modeling how the impacts of potential management actions may be reflected in your cooperative ecosystem indicators. So Christy, I'm going to pass presenter power over to you to get us started.
All right, good morning. Did I successfully unmute myself, Hillary?
You did. I can hear you great.
Excellent. All right, let me just put up the PowerPoint for you. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. As Hillary mentioned, I work for the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke, and I'm one of a team of people that's working on this project that's trying to trace, the connections between management actions and the LCC's indicators. Pat Halpin and Jesse Cleary here on the slide are working on the marine side of this analysis, while Dean, John, and I are working on the terrestrial side. This is an ongoing project. We've been working on it for a little less than a year, and we've got about a year left. So today I'm going to focus mostly on the terrestrial side and give an overview of the conceptual background of what we're doing, and then walk through where we are in the modeling process. So our role with the South Atlantic is, as our title stated, the obvious one is to model how actions affect indicators both directly and indirectly. Directly in the sense, like if you do wetland restoration, we want to model how this impacts the forest of wetland indicators, but it may also have impacts on other ecosystem indicators like the freshwater aquatic. So we want to make sure we're capturing both the direct and indirect impacts. And then the second goal that we have is to show how to embed these model changes and indicators into a decision support framework so that people could compare outcomes of different scenarios that they could choose. So to get started with this project, we worked with the LCC to come up with what we have called use case scenarios. And these are basically just different types of questions that we thought people working within the South Atlantic might be interested in knowing. We've got a number of things here. It's not an exhaustive list, but we came up with prescribed burning, green growth, coastal conservation actions, just kind of understanding what an organization's impact would be on the indicators, and also land acquisition proposals. We are going to be continue tweaking these and potentially adding some new ones, which we'll get to a little bit later. But for starting right now, we are working with the prescribed burning, one of the reasons being for the grant that the LCC just received for the resilient fire landscapes. And then also looking at some land acquisition proposals that the South Atlantic already knew about. So for prescribed burning, the goal is to create a tool that will output changes in the pine and prairie ecosystem indicators based on a user input file, shapefile of either land that has been burned or could be burned. And then for land acquisition, we also want to do a GIS tool, but that one will hopefully output changes to all affected indicators based on, a proposed land acquisition. All right, so now that we have our goals, we thought about, how are we going to get there? And the first thing we wanted to do was try to conceptually trace out the connections between, management actions and different indicators. And we use a tool called means-ends diagrams for that. They do exactly what they say. They connect means, in this case, which is the actions, to the ends, which are indicators. And the way that we use them is we trace the ecological changes that happen between those two things. Means-ends diagrams have a lot of other names, and they're used in a lot of applications, so you may already be familiar with them in other contexts. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to walk through the pine and prairie ecosystem pretty quickly here. I've got our two actions that we just talked about on the left, prescribed burning and land acquisition, and then our three indicators for the pine prairie ecosystem on the right, the pine bird index, the regularly burned habitat, and the pine amphibian index. Not only did I put the indicators in here, but I also started thinking about the different metrics that are used to measure those indicators. So for the pine bird index, it's actually a combination of habitat for 3 different bird species, red-cockaded woodpecker, Bachman sparrow, and northern bobwhite. And we could think about those in terms of hectares. Regularly burned habitat is really just thought about in hectares initially. And then the pine amphibian index is based on something called priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas. So in this case, right now, I'm thinking about those in terms of hectares as well from the beginning. So the first thing we start to think about is, okay, prescribed burning is going to change your forest structure, and any time you change forest structure or ecosystem structure in general, you're going to alter habitat suitability. So that's how we get kind of our connection into the pine bird habitat. The indicators I have shown here, area burned and canopy cover, they're not the only things that would change in the forest structure because of burning, but those are the two that actually fit into the way that we are modeling habitat suitability right now. For red-cockaded woodpecker, we're really just thinking about area being burned instead of trying to model changes in canopy cover and how that might affect whether habitat is suitable for red-cockaded, since they have such specific habitat requirements, and at the scale of the LCC, it would be very difficult to try to find one model that would actually work reliably for the entire area. But Bachman sparrow, as some of you may have heard last month, Brad Pickens has been working on doing some modeling for habitat suitability, and we know that canopy cover is one of the parameters in that model. So we are hoping to build his model into this and be able to alter canopy cover percentage. And then for the northern bobwhite, right now, that index or that habitat suitability is really based on the technical committee's recommendations. So we can probably say right now that if you burn an area, it's possible that it will become suitable for northern bobwhites. But RUA has actually reached out to people within the South Atlantic and also in the Gulf Coast LCC to try to develop some better models for northern bobwhite. So hopefully we'll be able to make that a little more robust in the coming months. So that's all our connections for the pine bird index. And then for regularly burned habitat, it's a very easy connection between just area burned and burned habitat. And then finally, for our pine amphibian index, we actually can't connect that one in. As I mentioned before, these are based on parkas, and parkas are pretty much expert-driven. So we can't really say, through any kind of model that burning is going to either make something more or less likely to be a parka. So that's our completed model for prescribed burning, and just for comparison, I'm going to show you one for the land acquisition. The first thing I want to note is land acquisition is really an avoided conversion problem. So we're really looking at what you're not losing by protecting the land. So we've got avoided loss noted with all the indicators on the far right. I also have a lot of dashes in here, and one thing that means-ends diagrams can capture is uncertainty. So all my dashed lines are because we know we're making some assumptions that may or may not end up being valid, particularly with the pine bird index. We're kind of making this assumption that if you're losing forest, you're completely losing habitat. That may be valid. We may end up deciding that we want to try to refine that later. So right now it's just kind of shown that it's possible to be connected. The other one that's dashed down here is the riparian buffers. That's a new indicator, and it's a different color because it's actually for the freshwater aquatic ecosystem. But depending on where you actually do your land acquisition, you could be affecting riparian buffers. So it's dashed because it's spatially dependent. And then for the pine amphibian index, we can actually model that one for this. Because we can probably pretty safely assume that if an area is converted, it's probably going to no longer be a Parcas area. The last thing to note here is a note about connectivity on the bottom. For land acquisition in the South Atlantic, anything that's done is probably going to have relatively localized impacts as far as the indicators go, which is not to say they're not important impacts, but at the scale of the whole LCC, it's probably going to be difficult to see those impacts. But connectivity could actually really be affected by even relatively small land acquisitions. So we'll be building in some connectivity analysis over the next couple of months as well to try to get at that. And I know the South Atlantic is actively working on trying to update their structural connectivity indicator. So once we kind of thought about, this is our map of how all these things are connected, we need to start thinking about actually how these changes in these indicators would be calculated. And I had thrown hectares out there a lot for my initial diagrams, but really when we start looking at what the indicators, what their values are for the pine bird index, that's actually a number of species per cell. So our change metric will be, an adjusted number of species, and we'll get at that through some habitat modeling and also some changes in area. The regulated bird habitat, will be a change in area, but it ultimately will be binary because that indicator is just a 0 and 1. Either it's regularly burned or it's not. Parcas amphibian index is the same thing. It's either it'll end up being a binary, either it is Parcas or it's not. And then for the riparian buffers, it'll be measured, right now as a change in the percentage of natural cover, but the South Atlantic is working actively on updating that indicator so that metric may end up changing. So we have our initial model, or we have our initial map, and then we have our the metrics that we have. So at this point, the mean zones diagram, the arrows that are in here just become models or calculations. So this just gives us the roadmap of how we're going to create the GIS models moving forward and what kind of metrics we're going to end up with here. Okay, so that's kind of conceptually where we started, and now once we start kind of putting these into GIS models, I'm going to walk through a pretty high level just what the two models kind of look like, and I'm not going to get too far into the weeds, but I'll be happy to answer questions if people have them. So for prescribed burn, this is a user, it's an ArcGIS model with a user interface, and we've got a number of inputs. The first is just your input shapefile of whatever area you propose to burn or has been burned. And then the two current indicators for regularly burned habitat and the pine bird index. Again, we don't include the amphibian because we can't make any judgments about what would happen there. We also need to have the habitat rasters for the 3 species that go into the pine birds. We need the ecosystem mask because we're going to mask the outputs just to the pine and prairie ecosystem, and then an output folder just to put all of the different rasters. So the first output that comes out here is the LCC is curious about areas that might be that people might be burning, but might actually fall outside of what they have designated to be pine and prairie ecosystem, just to help them refine that. So that's the first output that we get. The second one, with a regularly burned habitat, we end up with an updated habitat indicator, and then also a change raster that shows you what cells have changed values and by how much. For the pine bird index, we also get an updated indicator and a change bird indicator, or a change raster, but we're only including the boxman sparrow and the northern bobwhite in that. And that's because the LCC does not want to assume that by burning you are automatically creating new habitat for RCWs. So we decided to not use them in updating the indicator. However, we are interested in knowing what habitat is being maintained. So we are taking in the model and saying, okay, if it was already red-cockaded woodpecker habitat and it got burned, then now it's been habitat that's been maintained. So we've tried to capture that as well. So those are all the outputs that we get, and I'm going to show an example of what these look like. This is for regularly burned habitat. And I should say right away that I made up these polygons that we were going to burn because it looks like a pretty big area there on the map. So this was just for demonstration purposes, so we could get the models working. But we have the current indicator on the left, the updated in the center, and the change on the right. This is the regularly burned habitat, so it has values of just 0, either it's not burned, or 1 is burned, it's burned at least once. The no data values are just places that are not actually within the pine prairie ecosystem extent as defined by the LCC. In the updated indicator, we have a new value, and that's burned multiple times. So those have values of 2, and those are areas that were already 1 in the original indicator, and they also were burned again. The LCC wanted to make sure to capture a habitat that was being maintained. So we capture that with having values of 2. And then the change indicator has values of no change, and then values of 1, which is stuff that is newly burned or restored, and then values of 2, which is the habitat that's now been maintained. So for land acquisition, again, this is really an avoided conversion question. If the area were not protected and if it was developed or converted to agriculture, what would be lost in terms of the South Atlantic indicators? So what the tool is going to output is updated indicator and change files for 8 of the 11 ecosystems. This is in various stages of development. We have 4 that are pretty well developed and close, and then we have 4 that are certainly basically just at beginning stages. You'll also note there's only 8 out of the 11 ecosystems here. We are not including waterscapes because right now the indicators for waterscapes are based on dams, and we're not making any assumptions in terms of land acquisition and dam removal or potential dam additions in the future. The marine indicators, as I'm sure they'll probably mention here shortly, are undergoing significant revisions currently, so we're not putting those in the model yet. And the last one is estuaries. And conversion for estuarine ecosystems is it's more about avoiding conversion to open water as opposed to being developed or converted to agriculture, which is a completely different question than we're trying to answer here. So, so we're not including those indicators in this model. So the land acquisition model actually has a very simple interface. You just have to put in the shapefile of acquired land or potentially acquired land, and then 3 geodatabases, one for your outputs, one for your scratch intermediates, and then one of all of the current indicators. And then this pulls into a toolbox here. So this is the interface for the one land acquisition model at the bottom, and then that model actually calls all of these other submodels that we've created for each ecosystem and creates your outputs. So an example of what this looks like in practice, this is the forested wetlands birds. And again, we have the current on the left and the change on the right and the updated in the middle. One thing I should really point out is for right now in all of the LCC's indicators, values of no data just represent areas that are not that particular ecosystem. So for forested wetland, in the indicator values of no data are just places that are just not forested wetland. And when we're thinking about land acquisition, we wanted to make sure to capture the idea that this land is not just not forested wetland. It's not the ecosystem at all, and it's not any other kind of ecosystem. So we wanted to kind of set up this second value of no data of -9999. So that's what we have in the updated indicator. For the forested wetland birds, the values for that indicator are representative of different species that might be present. So whether you have prothonotary warblers or Swainson warblers or a number of other species, which I listed there on the slide. So then the change indicator, or the change raster rather, just shows you what the values used to be in those cells. So how you could answer questions like how much Swainson's warbler habitat have we lost potentially if we didn't acquire this land. All right, so as I mentioned in the beginning, the idea behind all of this is to eventually feed this information into an alternatives matrix to help drive decision making. And so the idea is that you could run the models for multiple acquisitions in this case, like I've shown here, and input all of the changes that are going to happen into this one matrix, and then try to make a decision based on that. This is kind of a shortened matrix. It doesn't have all the indicators for sure, but I just wanted to give an idea of what it would look like. We have a line for cost in here. That may be relevant. It's relevant in a lot of cases where decision or alternatives matrices are used. It may or may not be relevant for the LCC For many of the cases that we've talked about, cost is kind of embedded up front as how much it's going to cost, so that might not be something that's included. The last thing I want to point out about this is that the measures that are going to be, in these cells, they're not going to be directly comparable the way that we have the analysis right now. So, and if you have land acquisition 1, you might have a whole bunch of bird habitat. And you may have less in acquisition 2, but you may have more of your amphibian parkas habitat. So you still have to make a decision about what you care about more, if you care about birds or amphibians more. But this at least gives you a condensed way to put all that information into one thing and allow you to do some comparisons. So that's actually, all I have to present on about where we are and where we're going. As Hillary kind of mentioned, we did want to maybe have a little bit of a discussion here on, if there are actions that you would be interested in seeing modeled, given that you're working in this area. So I'm happy to open up discussion for that. We're not sure how much we can get to in the next year, but we're happy to hear what people are interested in doing and see if we can tackle that. And I'll also be happy to take any questions that you may have as well.
Great, thanks, Christy. Maybe we'll start out with questions about your presentation. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Christy about? Just remember *6 to unmute, or you can type into the chat box. Well, if there aren't any questions about her presentation, we've allowed plenty of extra time for discussion to get feedback from everyone who's on the line about other indicator action connections that you'd like to see your cooperative explore. I mean, are there issues that you wrestle with where if you were able to quantify the impact of your conservation actions, it would make a difference in your work?
Oh, this John Faustini. I was wondering. I was looking as I was watching listening to the presentation. So for the prescribed burns, is it assumed, or is it? I mean, I would assume they at least generally try to avoid burning riparian buffer, but I could see where it could conceivably affect riparian buffer on small streams or something. Is that something? There's no connection there. Is that just an assumption that's built in, or is that not an issue?
I would say that's probably an assumption that's been built in. But I can definitely go back and revisit that and make sure that we didn't miss that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we would do the prescribed burns in such a way that they wouldn't affect riparian buffers. But okay, just a thought that occurred to me.
No, it's a good one.
And I don't know, Christy, as far as our ecosystem extent definition, since I'm not too involved in the modeling, but whether we have a lot of prevalent, like pine and prairie in riparian areas.
I am not sure. I'd actually have to kind of investigate that, I think.
Yeah, that's a good question, John. Thanks.
I have a question.
Go for it.
This is Johnny Randall at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. I was just, as a follow-up question, I'm not familiar with prescribed burning in riparian areas, but has it been established that prescribed burning in a riparian area or a buffer has negative effects?
I don't think so. Not that we're aware of on this team here.
Okay. Well, I was basing that on the former question.
Yeah.
So I could see how it could benefit buffers.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the function and the part of it. Definitely could affect a buffer, and it certainly could affect canopy cover, and for example, stream shading in smaller streams, and that could be potentially a negative effect. Although certainly there could be beneficial effects as well. So I was just thinking about that as a potential interaction that we probably should think about.
Yeah, I mean, riparian buffers, this is Hillary, that is one of our freshwater aquatic indicators, so that would be worth exploring and just kind of thinking about whether there are other instances where we might encounter those unintended consequences beyond the relationships that we defined in the models?
I was just thinking about that a little bit more, and the reason it's not captured in the prescribed burn model is because the indicator for that is a % natural cover. And so in the actual indicator for prescribed burning, you wouldn't be changing whether or not it's natural cover or not. So right now, that's why it's not captured. It took me a minute to get back there and realize why it wasn't in there. But as the indicator is right now, we wouldn't be able to capture any changes based on prescribed burning. But if that's something that needs to be changed in the future, I'm sure the LCC can revisit that.
It's an interesting thought, potentially something we could bring up at the Freshwater and Waterscapes Indicator Revision Call next month, whether % natural cover is still the best way to capture riparian buffers and measure that indicator. Anybody else have a question or want to suggest any other indicator action connections? I probably will start calling on people. We have a small enough group, so.
I have a question. This is Louise for Christy. So based on your work, because, and let me just say, even though I am part of the South Atlantic LCC staff, I really enjoy your models and the way that they're demonstrating change. It's very nice and transparent. And you had spoken a little bit before, maybe I just missed this in the presentation, about other actions, potentially people looking when people from the natural resource community work with planners and do education and outreach for that. Can you speak a little bit about how you would expect those models to work?
Yeah, those are ideas that we had a couple of months ago. We haven't actually worked out how those would play out, I think, in a model framework. So we started this by doing what we know was pretty straightforward, just to kind of get the framework going for it, and then we're going to be building up into the more complicated things as time goes on.
It could potentially be something that we are able to refine and put better bounds on once we really get that American Planning Association project up and running, to get some insights from that planning community on how green growth practices could be assumed to impact the indicators.
Christy, are there any interactions that, based on your work, that you are particularly interested in that you think would be interesting and to pursue?
I had not thought about that. So offhand, I don't have anything in mind because we have these three other ones to model already kind of lined up with doing this work with the green growth, and then looking at more broad level of what an organization's impact might be. There certainly would be some work with restoration in that we haven't already captured. I guess with the one use case where we had the organization's impact, we thought we might capture most of that already within prescribed burning and land acquisition, but I can see we will not have captured, a restoration piece in there. So that's something that will certainly be interesting to work on.
Christy, this is Johnny Randall again, and I have a question with respect to our own nature preserves here at the Botanical Garden. We're part of UNC Chapel Hill, and we have several hundred acres that are connected with the larger New Hope game lands to the south, and our Mason Farm Biological Reserve is an incredible place for local biological diversity. We probably burn 100 acres per year out there, but we are not doing any really intense analytical work on what the effects are. They're mostly anecdotal and using photo points and such. Would you have any interest in coming over in this direction and talking with me about what we're doing out there? And anyway, I'd love to get your input. Not to put you on the spot.
No, it's fine. I'm looking at my team because I'm actually taking a leave of absence here very shortly, so I'll be leading the team here. But I'm looking at the rest of my team, and they're giving me some affirmative that yes, that would definitely be a possibility. So.
Okay. We still have, I mean, in this incredibly urbanized area, we still have bobcats and river otters in the creek, and black bears have been sighted out there again recently. So it's within the limits of Chapel Hill.
Well, that's great. Maybe Hillary, could I maybe see if you could connect us via email?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's why I'm here. And as folks are done asking questions, if they wouldn't mind putting their phone back on mute, I'm hearing a little bit of weird feedback. Does anybody have any other questions or suggestions for Christy before I start putting people on the spot? You're always welcome to pass, but maybe I'll pick on Gino because he's used to RUA going name by name on our steering committee meetings. Did you have any indicator action connections that you think would be really interesting to pursue going forward? Maybe Gino's stepped away. How about Kelly?
Hillary, this is Gino. Sorry,
Hi, Gino.
I had *6 and then still was on local mute here, so.
Okay, double mute.
I was double muted, which is probably a good way to keep me, actually. I didn't really have any questions about the presentation. I am curious a little bit about what challenges might lie ahead as we look towards the marine indicators.
Mm-hmm. Lots of challenges, I think. The first one being that they're doing some pretty significant revisions on those. So at this point, we're not even sure what the indicators are totally going to look like. So it's very hard to have any idea of what that process would be. But I guess the big thing is trying to understand the connection of things that you would do, on the land and how that translates to what happens, in marine indicators. And that's going to be a really tricky thing to model. So I know there's another team of people that's working with the LCC that's trying to answer some of those questions, and I think the hope is that we can tap into their knowledge at that point.
All right, thank you.
So in terms of other conservation actions, we talked about green growth, we talked about prescribed burning, about land acquisition. What other types of things do you all work on where an analysis like what Christy's described could help you articulate the impact of your work? Kelly, are you on the line? Do you have any suggestions? Maybe I'll pick on Scott. Just remember *6 to unmute, folks. How about you, Susan? Jim, do you have anything to suggest? All right, well, so much for putting people on the spot. I guess that's probably it for this section. Christy, did you have anything else you wanted to get input on?
Nope, that's it from our team. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining and listening to our presentation. So we appreciate that.
So before everybody jumps off, I'm going to take back the presenter power here and just give a couple brief staff updates and preview next month's presentation. So let me put my slides back up. So Rua typically shares an indicator revision update. He's down in Atlanta today, so I'm going to give that on his behalf. As we've been mentioning the last couple of months, the marine and freshwater aquatic indicators are a really high priority now in preparation for the small update to the blueprint that we're calling Blueprint 2.1. So this is just a really an effort to refine the indicators. We're not really changing methods or any broader ways that we develop the blueprint, just really trying to refine those indicator models. So those indicator revisions are going to be wrapped up by December. And on the marine side, the Marine Indicator Revision team met earlier this week and was very, very supportive of the models to be used in an update of the Marine Mammal Indicator that's coming out of Pat Halpin and Jesse Cleary and others at Duke. And then on the freshwater aquatic and waterscape side, that revision team is going to meet next month. So the date for that call has already been set, but if you haven't signed up yet and you still want to join, maybe some folks who ask questions about freshwater aquatic indicators, John, Faustini, I don't know if you're already on that team, but there's my email. Just shoot me an email and we can add you to the list for that revision team. And then just a quick sneak peek of next month's Third Thursday Web Forum. That's going to be November 19th, same time, same place. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Tom Allen with East Carolina University. We heard from Tom a little over a year ago about this project, so this is going to be an update on his team's work. He writes that salt marshes are essential resources for coastal conservation, but it's really challenging to map their spatial distribution accurately and with enough thematic detail that's really important to conservation. So the vulnerability of salt marshes to sea level rise often reflects complex interactions between hydrodynamics, ecogeomorphology, and relative sea level rise rates that really require a lot of local data. So this presentation is going to report on the development and refinement of satellite-derived maps of salt marsh distribution across the South Atlantic, as well as an associated sub-regional and fine-scale mapping and vulnerability assessment. So if you're interested in salt marshes, this would be a great talk to tune in for. And as always, I like to wrap up just letting folks know how they can get involved in your cooperative. So in addition to contacting your staff, that's me, that's Louise, or somebody else involved in the cooperative directly, like somebody else on the phone, I really encourage you to check out our website. We post frequent updates and events there, and that's also where you can go to learn about upcoming projects, opportunities to serve on teams like those indicator revision teams I've been talking about, and that's where you can find spatial data as well as the conservation blueprint, which I'd really encourage you to explore. Joining our web community, it also gives you access to our monthly newsletter, as well as a reminder about this web forum. So with that, I'll just open the floor for any additional questions folks might have before we sign off. We're wrapping up a little early today. It's only 10:40, so don't be shy. All right, well, hearing none, that's it from the staff of your cooperative. So thanks again, Christy, and your team so much for presenting, and appreciate everyone joining us today and sharing their feedback on this exciting project. So thanks, everybody, and hope to see you next month.
Thanks, Hillary. Thanks, Christy.